of the Blooming. All right. The Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group welcomes you to a presentation this evening by the author, Jonathan Ezra Goldman, of his fabulous new book, Hidden Histories of Jazz Age New York, From the Suppressed to the Strange. I'm Jim Mackin. I'm one of about 15 people from the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. I'm here with my co-director, Michael Gonzalez, who'll be handling a lot of the details, including questions and answers that we have. You can put them into the chat. So again, I thank you for zooming in on this live presentation by our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. Again, I'm Jim Mackin, and I'm with my co-director, Michael Gonzalez. Usually, Marjorie Cohen joins us, but Marjorie's couldn't make it this evening, but she's with us in spirit. So please go to our website, upperwestsidehistory.org. And if you don't remember that, upperwestsidehistory.org, just Google Bloomingdale history and you'll kind of get us. And we do all sorts of historical things in our neighborhood, such as this evening's presentation about hidden histories of Jazz Age New York, From the Suppressed to the Strange. Fabulous book by our guest speaker tonight, Jonathan Ezra. We have walking tours of the neighborhood coming up all through the summer. If you go to our website, you'll see that. We have some presentations on September 16th, 250-year anniversary to the day, the Battle of Harlem Heights. We'll do a presentation on that. And then in October, we'll do a presentation on a book I have coming out about 840 some odd notable people from Harlem. But tonight we have a special treat with author Jonathan Ezra Goldman, who'll tell us about his fabulous new book, Hidden Histories of Jazz Age New York. Jonathan is a professor at New York Institute of Technology. He has many other responsibilities. I just found out he's in a musical band, plays trumpet and whatnot. He's also the author of Modernism, is the Literature of Celebrity, and Joyce and the Law, both scholarly, rigorous, and narrative books, if you're interested. I read Hidden Histories of Jazz Age New York about 2 weeks ago. The book just came out in early May, and I almost read it in one sitting. I found it that compelling. As a historian, I have a bias towards interesting and uncommon details. So boy, is this my kind of book. But with no further ado, let's welcome Jonathan and let him tell us about the book. Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much, Michael Gonzalez, who's running the show here. I just want to, Jim, I'm really grateful to you for facilitating this, and to Marjorie as well, who's not here. I'm very grateful. And Jim, I'm really honored by your enthusiasm about my book. You're right. You and I do. We are both attracted to similar sort of arcania of history, and this is a little weird. I can't see anyone out there in TV land, so to speak. But if there are any of you who are not regular members of this group, the next time Jim is having one of his walking tours of the Upper West Side of the Bloomingdale neighborhood, run, don't walk to get there. Because I've been on a couple and they're fascinating. And one of the things, Jim, that I love about your walking tours is the way you basically say to whoever's there, which way do you want to go? And then the people say, well, let's go that way. And whatever direction you point in, Jim has a million stories about, who lived where and the history of the architecture, etc. So again, it's really an honor to have you introduce me. And I'm honored to be presenting to what I know is a very knowledgeable group of people here. I'm sure some or many of you will be aware of some of the material that I cover in my book and in this presentation, but I'm hoping some of it at least will be new. And my book is not specifically about Bloomingdale, of course. So what I've done for this presentation is pull out some of the local-ish material, and by local-ish, I mean I'm going to focus on a couple details of things that happened in the Bloomingdale neighborhood, but then I'll be surveying some of the histories I address from the 1920s in my book about Manhattan's West Side, um, from Midtown up through Morningside Heights. And by the way, one thing that I found, this is just I'm already going on a tangent, but one thing that I found looking through newspapers of the 1920s is that the term Upper West Side itself was thrown around a lot. It didn't always mean the Upper West Side that we talk about now. I found references to the Upper West Side, which meant what we would now call Inwood. Like they really meant Upper West Side when they were talking about Upper West Side. And I think I even saw a reference to the Upper West Side that was referring to the western part of the Western Bronx, basically. So it's interesting that the term Upper West Side crystallized between the 1920s and now, and that's not something I've explored specifically. It's just a little detail I thought I'd throw out here. Um, so my book is Hidden Histories of Jazz Age New York, and this talk is going to be ripped out of its pages, so to speak. So I made a little slide with ripping images, um, and oops, this is a table of contents ish sort of thing about how I'm going to be structuring the talk today. Um, so, just to orient us, going to be starting with talking about New York City as a world city, New York from above, New York on the ground, a baby parade and milk. This will all make sense later. Women and the NYPD, and then the Ku Klux Klan on the West Side. So, the 1920s was a sort of culmination of a couple decades during which it's customary for historians to say that New York City assumed the role as the consummate modern metropolis. So people talk about that happening over the course of the first decades of the 1900s, and then really peaking in the 1920s. This sense of New York taking over as the world's metropolis. I noticed in my research that in the 1920s, that's when that rhetoric really became popular. So there's this. Not only was New York taking its place as the world's metropolis, it was talking about it as the world's metropolis, which is an epithet that previously had really been reserved for London. So what you see here is a 1924 volume by William Bonner, which calls this the world's metropolis. It wasn't just world's metropolis; it was world city, or it was the city of the world. Lots of variations on that. It was really in the 1920s that you see a lot of New York talking about itself that way, and it makes a kind of sense because this was the culmination of several decades of New York really blowing up population-wise and blowing up immigration-wise. In the early 1900s, the neighborhoods were bulging with new arrivals. And then in the teens and in the 20s, the subway development led to the expansion of the urban quarters of the city. So development in the far reaches of the city was facilitated by subway development at this time. During the 1920s, the New York City continued to experience its ongoing population boom. But it was the non-Manhattan boroughs for the first time that were expanding more than Manhattan was. So actually, during the 1920s, Manhattan is the only borough that reportedly shrank in population. I mean, I sort of doubt that they managed to count everyone in those very dense neighborhoods. But the idea was there was so much development in the other boroughs, spurred by subway expansion, that the city as a whole was sort of exploding. Manhattan was specifically expanding upwards, and that was part of its it's the culmination of this identity as world city. So while Boston, for example, which had been a rival of New York as a cultural capital, had Boston had passed an ordinance in 1891 against buildings being higher than 10 stories, but New York passed no such ordinance and allowed developers to build high rises, soon to be called skyscrapers, which were, as Mike Wallace says, restricted only by the amount of elevator service. So, as elevator technology improved, you could build taller buildings. There was a reaction to that, quite by chance, in not quite the Bloomingdale neighborhood, but close. In 1921, businessman Thomas Healy wanted to build a 16-story hotel on his Upper West Side property, which was between 94th and 95th Street, between West End Avenue and Broadway. So the suspense is probably killing you, but a lot of you probably know what I'm talking about, right? Problems delayed the project. So frustrated, he instead commissioned a secluded gated enclave comprising two-story residences, accessible only by a private path. And he named it Pomander Walk, after Pomander Walk in London. And so this stretch of, oops, sorry, apparently, yeah, this is where I was going to talk about Pomander Walk. This is a 1921 article about this stretch of low rises that became known as an exclusive alternative to Manhattan's skyward growth and omnipresent crowds. Pomander Walk immediately became the site of some scandals. So Mrs. Dorothy Stoddard, in 1924, a resident of Pomander Walk killed herself via cyanide, and Julia Warnock died in her bath, and there was a probe because of bruises on her body, and initially it was said that she died of a heart attack, but it turned out that it was very likely a heroin overdose, actually. Okay, but going back to New York and exploding population-wise and exploding upwards, in this new development of New York City, it found a new way to talk about itself as the world's metropolis, but it needed a new way to visualize itself as well. Skyscrapers were offering a new way of visualizing the city. So they were taken advantage of, for example, in this short film by Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand. This is from 1921. The film is called Manhattan. It's available on YouTube to see. It's a fascinating 10-minute document of footage from fall of 1920 in New York City. You can tell that it's shot in fall of 1920 because they have scenes on Wall Street before the Wall Street bombing of 1920. And there was a lot of people were taking these photographs or taking images from skyscrapers, but this was just whetting the appetite for more and more objective views in New York City, and so there was a photographic map was eventually created. So this all started because in February of 1920, a Columbia College student named Sherman Mills Fairchild, who eventually became a sort of iconic figure in Silicon Valley lore, resolved to improve aerial photography for mapping and commercial purposes. He established his own camera company, and what he did was, people had tried to take photographs from airplanes before, but the camera shutters were too slow, so the images were too blurry. So he created a timer that would take rapid photographs, so the exposure was not as short and the images weren't as blurry. In 1921, Sherman Fairchild rented a biplane and sent his camera over Manhattan, capturing these larger and more detailed swaths of the city than had previously been possible. The newspapers loved this. They loved these images. and it sort of ratcheted up the discourse of talking about New York City as a world of its own. Um, um, and you can see these are just some examples of newspaper. The newspaper is using these photographs. Here's the images are very clear here, but this is downtown Brooklyn, and here's the Sunbeam Pure Food Warehouse in Williamsburg. Um, so New York City officials took note, and they were so intrigued that the Board of Estimates hired Fairchild to create a complete aerial map of the city. This is the first municipal government to commission such a thing, and this is what the complete map looks like. It's in the New York Public Library. Fairchild used 3 different airplanes, which among them threw a total of 3,000 miles and took 2,000 exposures. And the result is a 12 by 8 foot map. That's what the original of this is. It's made of 140 identically sized sections at a scale of 1 inch to 600 feet. And it showed every building and every street of the city. And even if you can look at it closely enough, ground level details such as trees and cars. And water tanks. And so the Brooklyn Times, for example, Clara Trenkman in the Brooklyn Times wrote, "With the vividness of a photograph and the accuracy of a map, here is New York." And this was a sort of exciting way for for New Yorkers to continue to conceive of their city as its own world, whereas as the city of the world. These two things sort of went together. Here are some. There was a key to the map created, so you could obviously you could pin each panel to its certain code. These are just some of the images I like. This is Flushing Meadows, which was the notorious dumping area of the time. You can see the Rikers Island that is much smaller than it is now because not as much landfill had been used off in the distance. Baseball fans will immediately recognize the old Yankee Stadium here. And here is our Bloomingdale, right? So if you can see my cursor, I hope you can. Right, so we could easily spot 97th and then 100th Street. Right, 100th Street is easy to spot because of the start of Manhattan Avenue up right here. So here's our neighborhood. And just because I was talking about Pomender Walk a moment ago, you can see it here. This sort of in the center is 95th Street, and Pomender Walk is right below. So this was one way people were looking at New York City, but while the Fairchild images were showing New York City as this grand and sort of impersonal entity from this, a view from above, meanwhile, the Daily News offered something very different. So the Daily News was launched in 1919, the city's first tabloid, much imitated over the course of the next decade and extremely popular. And the Daily News' mission, it seems to me, was to remind readers of street-level views of New York. Sorry, that's back on Pomender Walk. So I seem to be missing a slide, but one of the things that the Daily News pioneered was this feature called the Inquiring Photographer, which we now recognize as very standard in popular newspapers of the 20th century. And this was a feature in which a reporter would pose questions to the man on the street, so to speak, and you would get these pictures of 5 different people and their answer to a question. And the questions were all submitted by readers too. So the questions would be something like, should the city take over the subway system? And no, said most people, and that sort of thing. And they would give each answer from each person and their address below. So that's sort of my general introduction stuff to New York in the 1920s. Now, moving moving closer to home, and this is the story about Bloomingdale, the neighborhood that really caught my fancy. Um, in the campaign season of 1922, the Democratic Party of New York staged, in support of Nathan Strauss Jr., who was running for re-election in state assembly, right? And here we are, election day. So this has some. Well, this is primary day. So, but as we know, the primaries are the real elections in New York City, right? So this is a resident for us today. They staged a baby parade. Sometimes people ask me why I got so interested in the 1920s, and one of the reasons I got interested in the 1920s is it's very familiar to us as a moment. We can really recognize the modern version of New York coming into being, and yet I think people were wired very differently just 100 years ago in some way. And the idea of a baby parade as a political stunt is one of the things I like to point to as just this oddity that you wouldn't see in in the 2020s. But here they were. This is Nathan Strauss Jr., obviously the son of Nathan Strauss, Nate Macy's, and other claims to fame too. So on November 4th, is that right? Yeah, 1922, November 4th, wagons transporting 600 infants rolled up Broadway from 67th Street to 106th Street, ending at the small park bearing Strauss's family name, where one meets Jim for his tours. And the park had recently, as we know, been dedicated to his aunt and uncle, Ida and Isidore Strauss, victims of the Titanic. Now, it turns out, though, that the association of infants with the Strauss name would have made perfect sense to New Yorkers at the time, because Nathan Strauss, Sr., had been responsible for establishing milk stations around the city some 10 years before, during milk shortages. And these were stations that Health Director Raul Copeland called the greatest gift that New York had ever received. And although that was sometime in the past for 1922, milk itself would have been on lots of people's minds because there was a tremendous milk strike in 1921. And you can see this is the start of a picture from the Daily News of the start of the milk strike. There was so sorry. So let me go back to this for a second. And milk, by the way, had particular resonance to our neighborhood, of course, because the Sheffield Farms on 125th Street was the city's largest distributor of milk, if I have that right. Yeah, it had 20% of the market from its plant on Manhattan Street, which is in its building is now Prentice Hall of Columbia. So the 1921 milk strike was a major event. It was caused by, as it sounds like, a walkout of the street of the city's dairy workers, and it was exacerbated by the city's decision to break the strike. So the city took over distribution of milk, and because the milk workers didn't like this, they didn't like this the scab labor imposed upon them by the city. They started attacking the milk wagons, and then the police had to get involved, getting pressed into service, guarding wagons and the distributing stations. And even though there was this added security, violence dogged the strike. The dairy workers. So I have some details here about places where dairy trucks were attacked. 125th Street. 125th Street was one place where striking dairy workers got into taxis and had the taxis chase milk trucks, throwing things out the windows, apparently, until the police pulled the taxis over and stop them, pulled the taxis over and stopped them and gave them speeding tickets. Um, uh, Picketers were ordered to disperse, sorry, and were often they would refuse, and so law enforcement would get violent with them. And then so here's a headline from one example of that, because the police were the police were even brutalizing women who were demonstrating in favor of the strike. So on November 21st, 1921, Dr. Anna Montefiore, who is a member of the Women's Auxiliary of the Drivers Union, confronted a police captain about the brutal treatment of the women, and in response, he reportedly hit her and twisted her arm, and she showed the bruises to Mayor Hyland the next day. Meanwhile, so this is some more stuff about the milk strike. This is the beginning of the strike. The strikers planning to picket. Here's a cartoon at the time from Martin Branner, who is known for Winnie Winkle, of course. And this is the cartoon called, says the real sufferers, the women and children. In the meantime, Sheffield Farms and other companies were promoting instant milk as a solution to the milk strike. One offshoot of the milk strike was, sorry, just keeping my timer going here. One offshoot of the milk strike was that women reservists of the NYPD were put on emergency traffic duty. So they were, so backing up a bit, in the teens in the 1920s, there were 500 women. These were unpaid volunteers who made up the Women's Police Reserve. They were spread among the precincts of the city. They served various functions, including social functions, so creating, hosting dinners and that sort of thing. They were issued in early 1921. So if you look at the picture on the right, they were issued these new uniforms. This is from the Daily News. One of the features of the suit is that the vestee can be eliminated. The coat and skirt will comprise a natty sport or business costume. So this was given to the women reservists, who again had been pressed into service before guarding traffic crossings during the milk strike, because the officers who would have been in those stations were guarding the milk trucks. But this was around the same time that New York created what is to this day the only all-women police squadron in its history. So that launched in March 1921 at the 22nd Precinct in Hell's Kitchen. The precinct had previously been disbanded after decades of corruption. After it was disbanded, Commissioner Richard Enright turned the station over to Mary Hamilton, who was head of the department's Women's Bureau. And that's Mary Hamilton in the center of this photo right here. So this was on West 37th Street, 434, 436 West 37th Street. I did go by there at some point, and I think I have this right. The building's still there. It's been gutted and renovated drastically, but the actual structure of the building's still there. So Mary Hamilton was the leader of 150 women officers before this, and she had been advocating for a women's precinct since 1917. She was given the precinct, and she recruited Isabel Goodwin, who was the first detective on the NYPD, as her second command, and she brought in 20 other women officers. The 22nd Precinct was conceived particularly as a site to bring in underage itinerant women and set them on a path to rehabilitation. It had a volunteer hostess committee, which included Richard Enright's wife. Um, so they were, so people would get arrested, and their reception would be softened by this committee of women. And this is at a time that there was a tight connection between women law enforcement and progressive social workers. So they would bring women in, women would get arrested, brought in, and then the precinct had a variety of social services available, including medical care for venereal disease, and occupational training. So some of the women who were detained while they were waiting for their arraignment or whatever, they were given lessons in garment repair, and they were put to work mending secondhand clothes. And some of some of them would wind up wearing those secondhand clothes out if they needed clothing when they were released. The precinct didn't last long. It was disbanded in 1923. And New York has never repeated that experiment. Okay, I don't want to give away what's coming next too quickly. So, as I said in the beginning, I've pulled out some of the stuff from my book that's based in and around the Upper West Side. Um, and it was there was sort of a tough call about what to talk about exactly, and I felt some compulsion because as I was talking with Jim and Michael before the session started, we were having a conversation about how a lot of people make the assumption. Now I get that it's a natural assumption that my book's about jazz. I mean, everyone in this room, so to speak, this room, knows what the Jazz Age is and knows that the term the Jazz Age refers to the 1920s. But there's something about, I guess, the way the word jazz just jumps off the page of that cover, that a lot of people, before they've really processed the whole title, they have this instinctive response that the book's about jazz. So a lot of people, as soon as they see this, they start asking me music questions, and it usually takes me a second to realize that I have to say, just so you know, the book's about the Jazz Age, which is a way of referring to the 1920s, as I'm sure you know, and it's not about jazz, although I do talk about music some in the book. So I felt like maybe I should talk about some of the historic musical highlights of about having to do with the Upper West Side in the 1920s, or close to the Upper West Side. So I could be talking about Rice and Weber's club on Columbus Circle, which hosted, which was a place where the band that made the first ever jazz recording, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, they made the original what's considered the first jazz recording in 1917, and they were regular players at Rice and Weber's, which was a huge multi-story club on Columbus Circle, which I think shut down early in the 20s. I could have talked about that a little bit. I could have talked about the absolutely landmark musical Shuffle Along, Noble Sissel and Eubie Blake's Shuffle Along, which had its initial run at a theater on 62nd Street and Central Park West. And how that's hugely important in black musical history and theater history in general. I could have talked about Bessie Smith, who made her first recordings in 1923 at Columbia Records when it was housed in a building on Columbus Circle, where obviously this is several versions of Columbus Circle ago, but it is on the spot where the Time Warner is now, where the Coliseum was before that. And Bessie Smith, usually considered the most important blues singer at the time, had been turned down by several record labels because she was considered too raw, which they were euphemisms for too black, basically. Finally, Columbia took a chance and recorded her right there at Columbus Circle. And I could have talked about bringing it to closer to Bloomingdale. I could have talked about the Gloria Trumpeters, which was an all-women's brass band led by Edna White, who were very popular in New York City official street processions, including Memorial Day parades, where they were often found marching up Riverside Drive up to Grant's Tomb. But I really wanted to get some of the what's in the heart of my book out there, so I decided to talk about something much less fun than all of that, and that is the Ku Klux Klan and its arrival in New York City and its connections to the Upper West Side. Um, so, sorry, skipping ahead here for a bit. So, the Ku Klux Klan is naturally associated with its ground zero of the South and with rural culture. But the 1920s edition of the KKK was, by most accounts, as powerful or more powerful in the North than it was in the South, and as popular or more in cities than it was outside of them, and that included New York. So just to be clear, the original KKK that we usually think of first was, of course, the post-Civil War Southern terrorist group, and meant to fight against progress of black advancement. But the 1920s version was a little different. It was founded in 1916 when William Joseph Simmons, or 1915, William Joseph Simmons was at Stone Mountain, Georgia on Thanksgiving, and he watched a screening of Birth of a Nation. And he resolved to reboot the KKK, so to speak. And this version of it stood in its own propaganda unequivocally and unashamedly for white supremacy. Now, what that meant in the 1920s is a little different from what it means. I mean, the concept is the same, of course. But whiteness was thought of differently at the time than it is now. So whiteness wasn't really, in fact, a term used. The, the adjective
Are you
was
back? I'm just watching something on Zoom, okay?
the adjective was Nordic. And so people who were not considered white or not considered adequately white included Jews, of course. Italians were not considered white. The Irish, it kind of depends on who you're talking to at the moment. You know, they were in for some and out for some. But the point is, the Klan was against them all. I mean, it was anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, anti-Southern European, anti-Eastern European, and of course, it was still true to its origin, to the origin and the mission of the original KKK, anti-black. It took a hardline stance against immigration from anywhere that was not considered Nordic, and it proved hugely popular as sort of a nationwide backlash, sometimes called a nativist backlash against immigration. Between 1920 and 1921, the Klan increased its membership from a few thousand to over 100,000. So they had this intense recruitment drive that was very successful, and they reached as many as 4 million people, 4 million members, according to their own numbers by 1925, and then it started to decline in popularity. But during that time, in the early 1920s, it was a fairly mainstream movement. It was called the Secret Empire, or the Invisible Empire, but in many ways it operated openly. It influenced electoral politics. So the Klan helped elect 12 state governors, and of course it influenced federal immigration policy. So the severe immigration restrictions introduced in 1921 and 1924 were influenced by the Klan directly and indirectly, and the 1924 Act, which is called the Johnson-Reed Act. Well, Albert Johnson one of the sponsors of that act, was known as a Klansman. He was a congressman from Washington State. Key to the vision of the KKK was it's making inroads where the population of what they called undesirables was densest. And so they proposed New York City. Their hope was that New York City would be a grand division with a chieftain who would have a public office. And the first Grand Goblin, as they called him, was Lloyd P. Hooper of 320 Central Park West, the Ardsley. I'm thinking about. I'm sorry. Like I'm fact checking myself in real time right here. I think of 320 as the Central Park West as the Ardsley because I know the building well, and now I'm having a moment where I'm like actually not sure if it had been built yet. But I do have, regardless, 320 Central Park West, which is Central Park West between 91st and 92nd Street, is and now I'm not sure if I've got that right either. But anyway, it's in the 90s on Central Park West. That's where this Grand Goblin of the KKK lived. Hooper was a little bit of a weirdo, and in 1923 he would actually wind up suing the federal, the nationwide organization of the Klan for kicking him out, and I think his suit got kicked out of court. So imagine being the judge in that case and having to decide whether this guy's suit should go forward because he got kicked out of the Klan. Okay, so. Hooper set up a recruitment office at the Ormond Hotel, which was on 70th Street and Broadway, soon to be named the Hotel Embassy. Here, just some. This is the Klan. This is actually a picture on Long Island. We could come back to. We also, I think, we tend to think of the Klan as operating, on the fringes of New York City, not Manhattan, which is what I'm talking about at Manhattan here. This photo, because it's hard to get photos, is from a Long Island rally. The newspapers, I think this is kind of hilarious. This is from the Tribune. This is a way of trying to minimize the sinister aspects of the Klan by basing them as sort of a comic troupe. You can see the vaudeville dancers here all wearing Klan garb. I mean, it's taken in the right spirit. It's humorous. If it weren't all so awful, I think it'd be easier to see it that way. Klan hoods as Christmas tree ornaments. So here's that Ormond Hotel in 1920 on the left, and the building's still there, 70th and Broadway on the right. It became the Hotel Embassy in between, and now it's whatever that building, whatever function it serves now. Hooper soon gave way to another local leader, Reverend Oscar Haywood, who was the Reverend of the Calvary Baptist Church until he got kicked out. Hayward, one of Hayward's most active volunteers, was another local to us, Dr. W. Lewis of 307 West 91st Street. He was a veteran, and according to the research of Kenneth Jackson, he did a lot of recruiting in the Army and Navy clubs. So those were places where it was easy to sign people up for the KKK. Apparently, the Yale Club was also a popular spot to sign people up. This makes me think of how in The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway says he spends his evenings at the Yale Club. That's set in 1922, so it's right at this time. So imagine Nick Carraway sitting there and people are getting signed up for the KKK all around him. Part of The Great Gatsby we don't think about. By 1922, the KKK was claiming 34,000 members in New York City, including 21 functioning claverns. That was the name of the chapters. And there were gatherings in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens. Again, this was a strategy on the KKK's part. According to Simmons, the national leader, New York City was the most un-American of all cities. And the least American of all schools, he said, was Columbia. Um, Nonetheless, and perhaps ironically, Columbia, our neighbor to the north, Columbia, became a New York City entry point for the Klan. A lot of people at the time would have found would have found this unsurprising if they knew about it. They probably did. So Langston Hughes, for one, to name one very famous person, experienced a lot of racism at Columbia, such as black students routinely having their credentials challenged. Columbia was known for having a culture of bigotry, Southern clubs, blackface parties, the anti-Semitic quotas, which went into effect early in the 1920s. And amongst all this, word of a student clavern began to circulate. And in fact, in 1921, it was reported that Chester A. Arthur Jr., son of the late president at the time, Chester A. Arthur, was a member of the Klan, and so was his friend G.A. Rao, who then disappeared in mysterious circumstances after having some altercation at a Klan meeting. At By the way, those last two tidbits are things I have discovered since writing my book. So the research never stops, right? In 1923, at Columbia's graduation in June of 1923, a group in Klan robes proceeded through the ceremony grounds, cheered on reportedly by some onlookers. So the families were apparently some of the families were supportive. And this was all a prelude to what happened on April 2nd, 1924, when when the Klan burned a cross in front of Fernald Hall on the Columbia campus. This is just north of 116th Street. The building's still there. They did this because at the time it was a dorm, and it was a dorm that housed one black student, Frederick Wells. So, to tell the whole story, on the night of April 2nd, 1924, fresh snow blanketed the streets of New York City. And so imagine Columbia covered in snow. Here's a picture of the university at night. This is from 1916, just to give you a sort of sense of the shadows. Suddenly, the sound of automotive engines tore through the quiet. Cars roared through the gates at 116th Street. I guess security wasn't then what it is now these days. And they braked to a stop on the walkway. Out of the vehicles poured about 20 figures, pulling on white robes and hoods, and producing out of one car a 7-foot wooden cross, hoisting it onto their shoulders. They ran to in front of Fernald Hall, pushed the cross upright, and set it on fire in full view of the dormitory. Most importantly, the cross was visible from the windows of the room of Frederick Wells. Frederick Wells was I'll come to him in a second. The Klansmen danced around the burning cross for a few minutes before they charged into Fernald Hall, storming through the halls, shouting, "Put the N-word out," as Wells barred his door and prepared for an assault that thankfully never came. Wells was 25 years old, a Harlem resident, originally from Tennessee. He had enrolled in Columbia for the 1924 spring term. And first he lived in a private apartment, but when a room opened up in Fernald Hall, he moved in, becoming the only black resident among almost entirely white graduate students. There were one or two East Asians, apparently. About 15% of the students were from southern states. When he first moved in, supposedly his dorm mates assumed that he worked for the university before they started seeing him around. But when they figured out eventually that he had a room and he lived there, a group led by law student J.B. Rucker from North Carolina took a petition to the dean demanding he be removed. The Dean Herbert Hawks, in a good move, rejected them. And then Rucker took his case to the university. sorry, to the press. He had taken it to the press, took it to the university, and there was an article in the Daily News about how this group was demanding that the black student leave. Um, this apparently led this led to the Klan attack, um, which. So here's the Columbia Spectator report of it. Fiery cross at night points to protests against Negro. Dean Hawks not petitioned. This is a factual inaccuracy apparently because the news was reporting the petition at the time. And then here are some of the outcomes of the case. So the next day after the Klan attack, Wells got 2 letters from the Klan slipped under his door. One was a death threat, and the other was free advice from the Klan that he leave the dorms so it can be a place for whites again. Though that letter also acknowledged and complains about the presence of Jewish students. It says, "For as you perhaps know, the Jewish race is of colored extraction, which explains why you have some support, and why you have their support." Hawks, Dean Howard Hawks. So again, there are conflicting reports here. The dean says he will not be starting an investigation. Sorry, that's actually not a contradiction. That's right. He did not. The dean just announced that the Klan could not have been Columbia students. They were, as you can see at the bottom of this article here, in the opinion of the university authorities, the men representing the Ku Klux Klan were not students but outsiders. So they did investigate. Meanwhile, some of the white students were rallying around Wells. Wells was getting support from important black figures, including the likes of James Weldon Johnson, who was making public statements in support. And Wells, and other white students were telling the newspapers that Wells and his friends had staged the stunt themselves to win support, which is patently absurd, of course. Wells himself proclaimed to the newspapers, "I'm here to stay." But Wells was not here to stay, so to speak. At the end of the semester, he transferred to Cornell. And Columbia, after this initial sweeping under the rug, in a way, of this incident by saying no Columbia students could have possibly been involved in this, they decided to solve the problem within a year or so, in the way of friction between black and white residents by, guess what? Segregating the dorms. So they stopped black students from living in dormitories with white students, at least for a period after that. I wanted to end with this story because, like I said, it sort of gets at the heart of what I'm trying to do in my book, which is talk about New York City in New York City of the 1920s in ways that we don't often talk about it. We're used to talking about a decade of progress, a decade of economic boom, a decade of fun. I think it's important to that we reckon with the realities of our history in order to see our city from that time more squarely, and therefore see the city of our own time more squarely. I have some other slides thrown on here. This is just the backdrop to this is the insert from New Yorker Lothrop Stoddard's book, The Rising Tide of Color, about this is a nativist book, classic nativist text, published in 1920, edited by Maxwell Perkins, who was also Fitzgerald's editor. And what else? Well, let me just see what else I put here. Oh, okay. I just wanted to, before we get to the Q&A, before I forget, because I forget to do all this stuff that my publisher wants to do, I do want to let you know that On July 8th, I'll be at the Barnes and Noble on the Upper West Side, reading from and signing copies of the book. My interviewer there will be Hugh Ryan, the historian known for his books such as When Brooklyn Was Queer and the queer history of the women's prison, about the Jefferson Market women's prison. And if you are, if you want to buy the book right now, you can use that QR code, and there's a type in that coupon code at the top of the screen here for a 30% discount. I'm happy to share that now or later with anyone. So, thank you very much. Jim, should I stop the share, or Michael, should I stop the share,
Nope.
or leave it
I
up
think,
there?
Jonathan, I think you could leave it right there so that people will remember the book. And Michael's now going to facilitate some of the questions and answers, but I want to do two things real quickly. One, I want to welcome Marjorie Cohen, who signed in. Marjorie made tonight possible, Jonathan, by contacting you, as she does. Somehow Marjorie gets in touch with all the important authors. So we're so great. Marjorie's another co-director of our group. And just to wet people's
Can I just throw in? I'm Marjorie. I'm really grateful to you. I said it at the beginning, but you weren't here. I wanted to make sure to give you that shout out because I thought you're in absentia. So thank you very much for facilitating this event.
Yeah, I'm going to whet people's appetite just a little bit further. This book could only be written, Jonathan, by someone who has a very broad knowledge of the city, even before they get into research. And as you so aptly said, the research never ends. Um, I had a couple of favorite things. Let's see if this might get anybody's attention. One was the Black Amusement Park up on Hart's Island, which didn't materialize. But the fellow behind that lived in our neighborhood, our Bloomingdale neighborhood on West End Avenue around 97th Street. My other favorite little quip was, and we want to get to the Q&As, my other favorite little quip was your blurb about the creation, the automatic donut making machine up in Harlem. That was just precious. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And Michael, you ready for the Q&As?
Yep, sure am. All right, anybody who has any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. Also, feel free to raise your hand and I'll let you unmute yourself and ask the question. Yeah, take it away, guys. And then also,
So should I be reading the chat for the questions, Michael, or?
yeah,
Okay.
so far there weren't any questions throughout the meeting so far, so I'm just waiting to see if anyone else has any questions as we go. Again, also attendees can raise their hand and I will let them ask their question directly. I'm also going to get that link and put it into the chat so that people can find it easier. There we go.
Well, while we've got a pause, if anyone joined late and didn't hear Jim mention this and didn't hear me talk about it, it behooves you to get yourself to one of Jim's walking tours. They're so fun and so fascinating, and such a great way to you take a stroll and get a history lesson, and pick Jim's brain about local figures and the development of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I'll put those dates up again for those of you who just joined in midway. So couple
I
questions
see a
here.
question.
First, yep, go ahead.
Well, I see.
I'll ask.
Yeah, so the E. Goldman asked a question: were there any Klan events on the Upper West Side? None that I could. I mean, I was as I said in the beginning, I'm talking about the West Side here, and so I include Columbia and Morningside Heights in that West Side, not even if it's not quite the Upper West Side that we usually think of. So that was as close as I could get, but there were as far as I can tell, there were very few reported Klan events in the 5 boroughs at all. So the fact that one of them was, in our what I consider in our neighborhood of up in Columbia, I think is striking. And I mentioned the headquarters and recruitment office on West 70th Street in the Hotel Ormond too. So that's that runs the gamut of the West Side right there. there was an incident. There was there were that's the only burning cross incident I could find history of, in the five boroughs. There was some attack on a billboard, um, in in the Bronx. I write about that in my book. There were a few attacks on black families moving into white neighborhoods. One in Staten Island, one in Queens. I write about those in my book. So I'm just like, it's a finite number of Klan attacks, period, that I can find documentation of. And again, the fact that there's a presence in our neighborhood itself is striking to me, and strikes at the very heart of what I'm trying to do in this book, which is remind us that our own history is not always of one of tolerance, and acceptance, but right here in our midst, there have always been nefarious forces at work.
Yeah. Jonathan, I'm going to chime in the sense that one thing your book does convey is a real feeling for what the 20s is all about. And you do it through the little stories and whatnot. I can add that the book it was based on the Klansman, which I think was a 1901 or 1902 or 3, 4 book by Thomas Dixon. And he lived in our neighborhood on, I think, 94th Street near Columbus Avenue. And then, of course, Cecil B. DeMille, also, the director of Birth of a Nation, lived in our neighborhood. And so did his brother, William DeMille. William DeMille and John Barrymore were the first two hosts of the very first Academy Awards. I forget the exact year, 1928 comes to mind. So we're connected with Birth of a Nation in those two respects. But again, your book really gets, the 20s has a feel to it. The other great book on the 1920s, with all due reference to your book, I think is Terrible Honesty by Gene Strauss, written about, I'm guessing, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think Ann Douglas, right? Ann
Oh, Ann
Douglas.
Douglas, I'm sorry, Ann Douglas. Gene Strauss
Yeah.
wrote the Morgan biography. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What I thank you for mentioning these things, Jim. In the book, I'm trying to balance talking about these nefarious things with also making the book a fun romp through the 1920s, and these little anecdotes such as the creation of the automatic donut machine, that you mentioned, and the other fun stuff like the overalls parade and or the straw hat riots. These are, I think, fun stories to talk about the 1920s. It was an odd time, for sure. But again, why I've enjoyed researching it is because of how intensely familiar it is, and then you find something that really just strikes you as bizarre, and but that this just made perfect sense to the city. Like something like the straw hat riots, which are fairly famous, I think, but or not famous, which are fairly unknown except to historians and aficionados of New York history. There's a question: do you know what happened to Wells later in life? I've looked this up, and I'm not, but the details in my mind are fuzzy. But I think he went on. He had a successful professional legal career. But yeah, I don't remember the details of it. Carmen's asking about the straw hat riots. So quickly, because we could talk about that for a long time. There was a tradition in New York City, that you wore your brown hat until White Hat Day, which was in May. And then you wore your white hat, your straw hat, until Brown Hat Day, which was in September. And people on Brown Hat Day, if you were still wearing your white hat, some scamp of a youth might come along and swipe the hat off your head, knock it off your head, and say it's no more white hats. This is like like wearing white after Labor Day, right? But apparently it was a popular thing for kids, teenagers, whatever, to run around doing this. And then one year, 1920, it got so severe. There were so many gangs of youth doing this that they called it the Straw Hat Riots. Um, and the first group to be arrested for this and brought in the Lower East Side, group of teenagers were brought in, and the judge who sat in on their arrangement, this is the sort of thing you can't make up. His name was Judge Hatting, which just doesn't have any real historical import in anything. It's just a fun little detail, and it was the same judge who was involved in the Solomon Riley case about the canceled black amusement park on Hart Island. So one of the fun things while doing this research is coming across a name and then saying, "Wait a second, where have I come across that name?" And then you find that this is a judge or some figure who has appeared somewhere else. And so, in my book, these people like show up on page 66 and then show up on page 220, and it's one of the fun parts that I had writing it was reminding readers of where they had seen this name before. The Solomon Riley, I feel like I don't want to. I want to make sure that people have space to ask questions here. The Solomon Riley story that Jim mentioned about Hart Island is a really fascinating one, and really unknown until recent years, I think, or really sort of forgotten and obscured until it's come to light in various ways in recent years. And the short version of the story is that a wealthy black man bought a part of Hart Island and built an amusement park for black customers because the city's amusement parks, and there were many of them at the time, were segregated and off limits to blacks, or off limits to blacks except during certain hours. So he built an amusement park specifically for black customers, and unsurprisingly, the city, after dawdling for a little bit, shut it down, condemned the land, and bought it out from under him. This was done by the city's board of aldermen, and the president of the board of aldermen at the time was a fellow named Fiorello LaGuardia. So one of our great mayors. I don't know what role he played in that decision actually, but he presided over it. So it's again part of the city's history. We don't usually. I think it's not the image of New York that our mythology around New York City likes being out there. But I do think it's important to get those stories out there and confront that history. In order to see our own moment as clearly as we can. Thank you, Carmen, for your comments, and thank you, E. Goldman, for your question, and Gilbert Talbert too.
And I'll let Madeline ask their question, who's been raising their hand patiently. Let's see.
Okay.
Should be able to. Yep.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to add something to the Klan. I'm very interested in the history of the Klan. I don't know if people are aware, but Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump, on May 30th, 1927, which was a massive Memorial Day clash between the Klan and the police in the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens, New York. And it was May 30th, 1927. There were 1,000 Klansmen marched through Queens, eventually spurring a violent confrontation with the police, which turned into an all-out brawl. And they found out that Fred was involved because he lived with his mother at Devonshire Road in Jamaica Estates. And he was one of 7 men arrested during the melee. How about that?
Yeah, that's something. Thank you, Madeline.
Welcome. And the East Side, of course, it wasn't the Klan, but eventually it was the Nazis coming to the East Side. So we've had our share of both, the Klan and the Nazis, and discrimination against people of color, which also includes people who are Oriental, by the way. People always forget that they're considered people of color, and they weren't allowed to do a lot of things too. In terms of education, they were originally sent to black colleges when they showed up here. to get educated. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just want to add a little detail to this about um, Asian Asian Americans, Asians. The 1921
Asian,
immigration law
yeah.
didn't include anything about Asian immigration because it didn't have to, because Asian immigration had been all but made illegal by previous bans. It didn't mean that it didn't that Asian immigration didn't happen, but they didn't bother putting anything in that law about Asian countries. In the 1924 law, they specifically included something about Japanese immigrants because there was some sort of loophole that that Japanese immigrants were using um, um, to get to the U.S.
Well,
But yeah,
one of
the
I'm sorry, one of the only Asian places I know on the Upper West Side is a place I used to frequent as a child near Grant's tomb, and it was called Cherry Park because of, I forget, maybe 1,500 cherry trees were sent there by the Japanese government. Were you aware of that?
No, that's news to me. Although I'm wondering now if how close it is, or if it has any relation to
It's Sakura
the
Park.
Asia House that was set up by
Yeah.
Columbia in the early 1920s.
I'm,
Um,
I'm gonna I'm gonna chime in to say that thanks, Madeline. You're referring to what's now officially called Sakura Park.
Sakura, yes, because that's the name of a cherry tree.
Yeah, and there's a fella who lived at 334 Riverside Drive, just south of 106th Street, by the name of Joiki Takamine. And he was very instrumental in bringing cherry trees into the United States. He was a chemist by trade. He's in my book, and he's thought to be the first person to isolate uh, adrenaline. And
Oh,
he's
nice.
responsible for bringing the cherry trees not only into Sakura Park, but also into Riverside Park. I don't think he was involved with the cherry trees down on the Washington Mall, but I think he might have had a role in Branch Brook Park in Newark, which is still to this day the largest grove of cherry trees.
right, right. I was in error. It was in 1912 that
Uh,
the Japanese sent the cherry trees over. But it's
yeah,
unusual because Japanese people weren't considered human beings.
that's right.
So it's kind of great that they still exist.
Yeah.
There were a lot of students from East Asia at Columbia at the time, and a lot of them at Columbia's Teachers College, which had a different name at the time. Um, but there was a Chinese Students Association at Columbia that had over 100 members. So that was one way that people were coming from Asia to the U.S. to attend
Yeah.
university.
Yeah. And one of my relatives was the naval attaché to Japan and China in Tokyo and
Wow.
died mysteriously in 1913 in
Wow.
Tokyo.
Yeah. I'm going to add one more little tidbit. This is the stuff that Jonathan and I and our other members of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group live for. The old Nippon Club, the building still exists on
Right?
93rd Street. And I guess you know, Madeline, between Columbus and Amsterdam on the north
Yeah.
side, just facing Joan of Arc Junior High School. It's now a Pentecostal church, I believe. But if you look at it, you can get a sense of the grandeur of the Nippon Club when it existed. And this fellow, Joiki Takamine, was head of it for a while.
Ah, wonderful. Well,
So,
we have the West Side is a very rich place. It's fabulous that you're all collecting all this information and sharing it. So thank you. It's been
thank you.
very, very enlightening. I'm going to buy the book, but I
Okay.
haven't figured out how to get the discount. I
Um,
tried using the QR code, and it came up with the information on the SUNY books.
right. So you put in that discount code when you're checking out.
With whom
SN
do I check out? With Barnes and Noble?
No, with SUNY Books. You
Oh,
click,
with SUNY books.
yeah, click order here or
Okay,
whatever it says,
right, okay.
and and then just copy the discount code SNW S26. I'm putting SNW S2
Wonderful.
S26. There it
Great.
is.
I see it. Also, do you have anything on Carmenville?
No.
Oh, on 151st Street, where Kareem Jabbar used to, there's a basketball court where he played. But it was founded because the railroad went up there originally. And my family lived there, so that's how I know about it. Carmenville. Carman, after the guy who built the brownstones all over Manhattan. Mr. Carman.
Yep. So, Madeline, again, you we could probably go on for the whole evening.
All night, all night. I'm sorry. I didn't mean
No,
to.
you're going to be pleasantly surprised with my next book, which comes on October 6th, about notable New Yorkers from Harlem. And
Uh-huh.
there's a little section in there on not only Richard Carman, but Carmenville.
Oh,
And
great. Great. Oh, I'm so
it's
excited.
never so brief. It's a type of thing that Jonathan would run circles around because he's the master of research. You know, there's so people are going to be so pleasantly surprised, Jonathan, when they dive into your book because you cover all the boroughs too, Queens,
That was intentional. Yeah.
yeah, and the
I
Bronx.
didn't want to write another Manhattan-centric book.
Yeah, yeah. But
And
Michael,
yep.
if we don't have any more questions, maybe we should wrap it all up.
Yeah, one last question to wrap it up, and this is going back to your book, but is there any can you talk a little bit about, you talked about the Upper West Side, and I guess the question is there any references towards music in the 20s? I understand it's not particularly towards music, but just as
Music.
a whole.
Yes. I mean, I have whole sections about music, and so I know it's getting late, and we're probably all hungry, and so I'm going to keep what could be a 2-minute tirade to as few seconds as I can. Um, but I want to say this now that the opportunity has arisen. One of my issues. So I like to say I have beef with the term jazz age, for a number of reasons. And one of the beefs is that the 1920s were a moment of an absolute explosion in New York City of the recording of music from around the world. So the record labels, this started in the teens, but it was really tremendous in the 1920s. The local record labels recognized the customer bases that they had all over New York City, and they also recognized that there were musicians who had emigrated from these countries who knew these traditions, and they began recording music, or they again in the teen, it started in the teens. They were music from all over the world got recorded in New York City. Music from Central America, music from obviously all over Eastern Europe, in every language and every tradition of all the different Eastern European communities. So you had Polish music, Czech music, Hungarian music, Russian music, etc. They were all it was all getting recorded. Japanese music was getting recorded. Central American, I said already. Middle Eastern music. There were two record labels in competition with each other across the street from each other on Washington Street, just devoted to Arabic music traditions. So think about like a city that could sustain two record labels of Arabic music in the 1920s, and you get a sense of how much music from around the world was getting recorded at the time. And so to call this moment the jazz age, to me, does a disservice to that history. It really reduces it. Now, of course, New York City was a central locale for black music and also for jazz music, and I will call those things differently, because what we often call jazz now, what music that was called jazz in the 1920s isn't always the same music that we would refer to as jazz now. So things, basically anything that had any hint of syncopation, was getting called jazz in those days. Even though, it's music that if we listen to now, we would say like that doesn't sound like jazz I know at all. So again, so this is all in my book about how there was music from around the world getting recorded, and some of the musicians, and a guy named Nathaniel Shilkret, who was at Victor Records, who was a virtuoso of putting bands together for every musical tradition from around the world. And I'm sure he had a lot of the same musicians. Um, so he himself was leading bands that would do Mexican music one day and then Polish music the next. It was a fascinating time musically. So my book's not about music, but I couldn't help but include music in it because, as someone Linda is saying, music was such an important part of New York City's culture at the time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And with that, I think we'll be ending the talk for tonight. I will remind anyone that came in the middle of the talk or didn't get a chance to watch this recording will be up later tonight, and should be on our website by tomorrow afternoon. So please feel free to send the link to your friends, or go rewatch the beginning parts of the talk if you missed that. And thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.